Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming during your lunch break. Um, as Thank you, Haley. As Haley mentioned last week, we went over kind of the 101 of stress, trauma, burnout. So today we're going to focus on organizational leadership as it relates to stress and trauma and burnout. Just a little bit about me for those of you that weren't here last week. I've spent a lot of time in nonprofits. My first job out of college was in a nonprofit and worked my way up to being an executive director and a board chair. Spent a lot of time working in healthcare settings. I'm a licensed professional counselor. I'm also a certified human resource professional. Um, and right now, what I do in consulting is I help leaders develop high performing teams. And so today we're going to get into um, a brief little overview for the folks that weren't here last time about stress, burnout, and compassion fatigue. Then we're going to get into the fun stuff. How do we intervene? And what are some policies and procedures and best practices that we can implement as organizational leaders? So you work in a nonprofit, right? And so today I'm specifically focused on leaders. My question to the group is, why do you leaders work in a nonprofit? If you want to, you go ahead and type something in the chat, but this is more about kind of reflection. You're probably not doing it for the glory. You're probably not doing it for the money, right? You're probably really invested in your organization's mission. So this is a brief little deviation from our schedule, our plan, but I want to hammer this point home because it relates to what we're going to talk about. Um, I knew this physician, and that was a quote that he said. Basically, what he meant was he didn't really take care of his body, and he paid the price for it. And part of health and wellness and preventing burnout and compassion fatigue is taking a look at the whole picture, right? So when we talk about stress, burnout, compassion fatigue, I want you to think about it today as a continuum, right? Stress is a pretty normative experience. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. Burnout, okay, we're more concerned about that. That might be why you're attending today. And then compassion fatigue kind of being the next step, burnout being the precursor. So stress isn't all bad when we talk about stress. Oftentimes we talk about it like it's a horrible thing, but really it can increase performance. Stress can be a strong motivator. It's not necessarily a bad thing. But in the context of what we're talking about, job stress, like we worry about that. Um, so the CDC, the way they define job stress, right? That what really resonates is when the requirements of the job don't match the capabilities, resources, or needs of the worker. Last time we went into some of the details of the biological and psychological effects of stress, but I think we can agree we know what it is, and none of it's really good. Now, burnout, this is a phenomenon that starts with stress and gets a step further. And the World Health Organization, there's their definition of what workplace burnout is. So when I think about workplace burnout, I think about kind of agitation, right? It's, if my baseline is here and I'm experiencing burnout, there's new things that kind of pop up. So I'm more annoyed. I'm being cynical, right? I don't believe that I'm doing as good a job as I did before. And we'll contrast that um, with compassion fatigue in a moment. But when we think about it in the organizational level, workplace gossip, things like that, these are new behaviors that are getting added into the mix that can be problematic. So employee burnout, where does it come from? Lots of different places. It really depends on the setting and the job and the culture, but these are some of the main contributors that folks report. So now when we think about compassion fatigue, think about it more like exhaustion, right? So if we're talking about burnout is I'm adding behaviors or something's being given, think about compassion fatigue as something's being taken away, right? I'm more withdrawn. Um, my personality's not there. We'll get into the details, but Mother Teresa kind of recognized this phenomenon and asked that her staff take a year off for every 4 to 5 years that they were working. So this is where we see it showing up with employees. We categorized it in physical, emotional, and work-related symptoms. It's different from everybody, but essentially when I see somebody that has passion fatigue, usually they look like someone that's been traumatized. They're withdrawn, they're not really there. People will talk about a personality change. When we look at some of the work-related symptoms, lack of joyfulness is a big one. So I asked AI to draw a picture of the difference between compassion fatigue and burnout. So this is what AI came up with. I just thought it was interesting and would put it in there. But what it does reflect is burnout being something that's happening, right? Compassion fatigue being something that's not happening, right? So when we think about those differences, the the profound shift that occurs with helping professionals, right? In the way they experience work, but also in their personal life. So now let's start thinking on the organizational level, like what's organizational trauma? So a big part of my job is I go into workplaces and I help leaders with a lot of different things, but they all relate to developing teams and people. And when I go into an organization, remember, I have 20 years in nonprofit. Um, I've worked in organizations that have experienced trauma. What are the hallmarks? What do I see? And so these are some of the symptoms that are pretty common in organizations where a lot of people have experienced a burnout or compassion fatigue. But wait, there's more, right? Um, so this isn't like some clinical checklist where if you have all these, your organization is traumatized. But I want to point these out because these are all pain points, particularly for leaders. So when I think about like workers' comp claims and absenteeism, there's dollar amounts attached to that. Um, and chances are it's not someone that just wants to rack up a bill and make the workplace miserable. Oftentimes it's related to organizational trauma. So now I want to take a moment and talk about you. Let's talk about the leader in the situation. You have a really, really tough job. And I want to acknowledge that I've been there, I've done that. I want to kind of take the temperature of the room. These next two slides is some national data that I pulled to make sure we're talking about the same thing. So here's the first one. Key nonprofit challenges. So this was a 2023 survey that Nonprofit Pro did. And when they look at the nonprofit leadership challenges, they look at lack of resources, staff turnover being, in the top three. And so this one, please take a second and type in the chat. Do you relate to this? Is lack of resources one of your top concerns? Acquiring donors, staff turnover, does that look right? Is what you're experiencing the same as what folks are experiencing on the national level? So I'm going to go to the next slide and the same thing. I'm going to ask for a response, but I want to make sure that this is hitting home. So staff management struggles. Number one concern reported being providing staff members with competitive compensation. Can you pay them enough? Is that one of your top concerns? Followed by not overworking staff members. It's not like leadership teams sit around and think, how can we overburden people? Leadership teams think, how can I solve a problem? How can I work with what I have? And then retention kind of being number three. Haley, I can't see the chat. Could you echo whatever's in there verbally, please?
Yeah, of course. So Laura did post that there's just too much to do, too little time, and not enough people. So yeah, it really plays in with that staff and access to resources.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that. Thanks for putting that in there. So let's talk about nonprofit leaders. Let's talk about you again. So, I mean, there's been study of nonprofit leaders, like what's working, what's not working. Um, there was this study that I cited here that talks about nonprofit leadership dispositions. What is it about you is nonprofit leaders that make you successful? And so this particular study, they looked at people that had 10 to 20 years of nonprofit leadership experience in New York. And they identified 9 traits that were pretty consistent for folks across the spectrum. The one trait that stood out above everything else in helping people be successful was grit. Um, so I thought that that was super interesting. Again, this isn't a checklist. It's not that you have to have all 9 of these, but these were some of the themes. The other theme that popped up was the transformational leadership versus transactional leadership, right? So when I think of transformational leadership, I think about building a coalition, motivating people, right? Bringing the best out in folks. And that kind of fits, right? People don't come to nonprofits usually for the money, they come for the mission. So again, for you as leaders, before we get into how can you help your organization, we got to start talking about what is it that you can do to minimize your risk for burnout or compassion fatigue. And so the first most important thing, the thing people like to hear the least is exercise. That is the single most important thing that you can do to mitigate, prevent burnout and compassion fatigue. Second one, quality mentorship and coaching. Leadership is lonely, and I want to validate that. And a lot of times, you're not going to be able to get your needs met within your organization directly. You might need to go outside your organization and maybe join a trade group or meet with peers. If you have a supportive board, that could be a huge source of mentorship and coaching as well, depending on the dynamics of your organization. But putting time and energy into cultivating a supportive board absolutely is worthwhile. And then the last thing is grow and trusted leaders, um, your management team, investing in them so they can really shoulder some of the burdens. And the right hand side, what we're doing is looking at a Harvard Business Review article where they looked at chief medical officers. And what they did is they found that these chief medical officers, 69% of these chief medical officers said that their stress level was severe, very severe, or worst possible. Not a fun job, it looks like. But then when they looked at the level of stress correlated with where these people were with respect to burnout, what they saw was emotional intelligence was the differentiating factor. People can do a great job in a really highly stressful environment if they have a high degree of emotional intelligence. So that's a nudge to everybody to really be cultivating that. So how can we intervene? How can we stop the process? This is why you came here. So we're going to get into, some assessment tools and things that you can be doing as an organizational leader. Um, they say a smart person, learns from their mistakes, but a wise person learns from other people's mistakes. And I think that's part of why I like The Office so much is Michael Scott tends to make a lot of errors. And here's another article on how leaders stress out employees accidentally, right? And when we look at these top 5 things, use of negative language, unusual erratic actions, emotional volatility, pessimism, ignoring people's emotions, doesn't that look a lot like burnout? Right? They're very, very similar. So leaders, aren't trying to do these behaviors, but when they're burnt out, a lot of times they'll percolate to the top. So in your workplace, let's look at it from a couple different angles, right? The first angle is awareness. Like, what's the conversation in your organization around burnout and compassion fatigue? Do you validate it? Do you talk about it? Is it part of your onboarding process? Um, when we think about organizational assessments, I want to make sure that we're differentiating employee engagement versus employee satisfaction surveys. Satisfied employees aren't necessarily engaged employees. Um, when you're doing your assessments, including your board and your leadership team, getting an objective third party. Um, I'll give you a bunch of free open source tools towards the end of the presentation. There's paid tools as well. But what I want to emphasize is when you're doing an organizational assessment, if you're taking time for people to submit information, you got to let them know why. And you have to communicate back to them the outcome or the results of whatever it was that they said. Last thing is talk about like regular continuing education, right? When people come to the organization, if we're really going to weave this into our fabric, um, what do we have in terms of updates? How are we communicating what we're doing as an organization? Do we have a wellness team? Are we doing lunch and learns? Do we have an EAP? Employee discounts. These are just different things that some organizations do to prevent or combat stress and trauma. So this list isn't to guilt or shame you into doing all the stuff that you know you should do. We all know that we all should eat organic. We should get massages. We should burn sage, but we don't do all that stuff. Um, Take this list and use it as a challenge to yourself. Is there something on here you used to do that you like to do that you probably should do? So just a reflection point before we move on. All right. So let's look at organizational structure. As an organization, how can you prevent burnout in the way you're designing the organization? Is the workload match what people are trained and hired to do? Right? In nonprofits, oftentimes someone quits, someone else takes on the job. Now they have two jobs. Job design, when I think about that, that's about being really intentional about what a worker's skills are and how they're using those. So it's kind of the opposite of what I just described. Clearly defining workers' roles and responsibilities. Brene Brown says to be clear is to be kind. Um, that has to happen. People want to be successful. They want to know what they're measured against. The next one being how are workers engaged in participating in making decisions that are affecting their jobs? So that doesn't mean that we ask people, what do you think you should do? If the task is to, um, let's just say, unload the truck, how you do it is up to you, right? That's the giving them choice in making the decisions. Communications come up all the time. And then the last one, the work schedules being compatible. We're seeing increases in the workplace with people really wanting that work-life balance and flexibility. It's one of the leading reasons people will leave a job is lack thereof. National Council of Nonprofits. What do they have to say about all this? How can they help us effectively manage our workforce? And so they give us some pointers. I know you can take a second read through those. Um, what I want to really highlight here is data. We got to get data. We have to use data to help us do all these things, to measure satisfaction, to measure burnout. Um, Getting feedback from employees and implementing that in the organization is vital. And as an organizational leader, how do you know that you have the right information? What if your perception is off, right? We know that people might behave differently than, when we're present versus when we're not. You got to get your data from different places. All right, so here's our assessment tools. I talked about the individual assessment tools last time. They're all free, open source, and you can locate them all here at this link. Organizational assessments, these links are embedded, so you'll be able to access these when you get the slide deck. What I want to caution you with organizational assessments for stress, burnout, compassion fatigue, they're not quick, they're not simple. It's not a questionnaire you're going to take. They're a lot more involved. And so these are four different frameworks that you can look at and use. Oftentimes they involve, there is some, kind of checklist type deal, but usually involves getting the board to the table, including your leaders, including your frontline staff, getting inputs from different areas and comparing that to standards. So you might have heard of the concept of a trauma-informed organization, right? So the idea behind that is, we have organizations that are trauma reactive. People have experienced trauma, now they're working in our organization. Let's say we don't have a clear org chart. Let's say that jobs aren't equally balanced. All these things that happen in organizations can really interplay with people's pre-existing experiences with trauma, right? And the other end of the continuum, and I've never seen one of these organizations, these healing organizations. This is an ideal that everybody can strive for. But really what we're looking at is, what does it mean to be a trauma-informed organization? And think about trauma informed almost as like universal precautions, like, if you're dealing with blood or, that kind of stuff. Um, Trauma informed is universal precautions for people, employees, and leaders that have experienced trauma. It's happened. It's the expectation. So, what's going on in our organization that we can consider when coming up with policies and structures? And here's the answer. If you want to become a trauma-informed workplace, your policies are reviewed regularly. How many of you have policies that are in a binder on some shelf from 1982? Your organizational policies really need to be based upon trauma-informed principles, right? Like transparency and collaboration. Your policies have to be accessible. If I don't know what the policy is and you're trying to hold me to it, that's not really fair. Up to date, and then are they followed? Are you only following 9 of the 29 policies? Again, how do I know which one to follow if the other 20 don't apply? For your org structure, it might seem real basic, but you'd be surprised how many organizations I work with that don't have a clear org chart or a clear reporting structure. Is your board a decision-making board? Do they have information about employee turnover? Usually not. Should they? That's a conversation you should have with them. And then the last thing, the transparent hiring and promotional process, that's getting to be a bigger and bigger deal as time goes on, right? When we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So winding down, here's my general leadership tips for folks on this call, for new leaders, for old leaders. I just want to point out the value in being authentic, being the real you, remaining teachable and humble. That's so important, particularly with new leaders, identifying management skills, right? There's a big gap between leadership skills and management skills. They're two different things. They do overlap, but particularly with new leaders, we have to teach and model those skills to them. The support system, I talked about this a little bit, but in the next two kind of go hand in hand with that idea of get some outside support. It can't be your coworkers. It can't be the people that report to you. Get a mentor, get a coach or a therapist if needed, right? And then keep pursuing learning. So employee wellness program, that's a whole nother presentation, but just some basic tips or principles for you if you're starting to go down that route is make sure you're collaborating with the whole part of the organization. I worked with an organization once and me and the HR director were joking about pet insurance. And it turns out this organizational director was smart and did a survey of what employees wanted on their benefits, and pet insurance made the list. So be open-minded. When you're getting that strategy, when you're developing this, make sure your leadership team is involved, right? Don't skip right to the front line. Everyone needs to be there. Monitoring and utilizing data, so important on so many levels. But yeah, make data-driven decisions. And the last thing is, you know, your employees are going to care a lot more about how you implement something rather than what it is. So in summary, you're not a robot. Take care of your body. Really, you should be assessing your organization for burnout and compassion fatigue in different ways. And, you know, in 2024, preventing and addressing compassion fatigue and burnout should be a top priority. You should be putting a lot of time and energy into this. And it doesn't have to be super expensive. Lots of free and low cost resources available. A bunch of them on my website. I'm happy to share anything I can. So with that, let's shift gears and jump into the Q&A. A lot to take in.
Jay, last week when we were talking in the first part of the series, several of the participants mentioned their experiences with generational differences. And I wonder if you can speak to that. Like, how does an organization address that with, addressing the culture? Is it, about gathering data and figuring out what staff want to see happen? Or is there something like underlying that can be, I don't know. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, thanks for the softball, Laura. No, seriously, thank you. I mean, right, that's a question on a lot of folks' minds. Um, Google, about 10 years ago, started a process where they started gathering data on all their high functioning teams, right? And they looked at all these different dimensions, like which team had a very clear leader, what were the personality traits involved, how smart was this, that, the next thing. They looked at all these traits, and the only thing they really came up with that was interesting and new was what determined the effectiveness of a team was how they connect and relate to each other. All about connections and relationships. That never changes. That's always the answer. The question maybe would be, well, how do we do that generationally? Um, and I agree, it's challenging. I think it starts from the door. When you're interviewing folks, when you're recruiting, when you're attracting people, what are you messaging about the work? How are you communicating what the expectations are? One thing we hear a lot more that we didn't hear as much is um, people newer to the workforce setting boundaries, saying, I'm not going to pick up my phone after this time, or it's my birthday. I always take my birthday off. You should make that policy. I see you guys smiling. I'm smiling too, right? Because like that was unheard of 20 years ago when I entered the workforce, but that's the reality now. So if we're about relationships and connections, how do you navigate that? For those of you that are parents, um, you've had kids that have had a different expectation about what something should be. Maybe that happened a lot, and you had to bridge the gap and you had to figure it out. Um, I'd say in the workplace, same thing. The old rules don't necessarily apply. It doesn't mean everyone gets a hall pass and gets their birthday off because that's what they want. That's not professional. What would be professional would be to coordinate and collaborate with my supervisor or boss around taking time off, planning ahead, right? Those are some professional skills that people need to learn. And I think we really took that for granted in the past. And folks coming into the workforce now don't have some of the same experiences that yielded some of the same behaviors that we've valued over time in the workforce. Laura, I hope that if that didn't answer your question, hit me again because I want to make sure I address it the best I can.
Soaking it in.
Yeah, you and everyone else in the world, Laura, right? Like there's a news article about this every day. We're having a hard time adjusting and adapting. Um, COVID really put a big dent in it. Um, the other piece of this is when the pandemic hit, people started looking at work differently, right? That was like the inception of where remote work kind of became a thing. And everyone started rethinking um, what's important in a job, what's important at work. And they started having those conversations and they started expecting different things from employers than they had previously. And um, for organizational leaders, I think it was really hard to catch up because that change happened so quickly. Um, I hope that what came through in the presentation today was me validating how tough it is to be a leader, to be an organizational leader. We tend to not get a whole lot of empathy. And then when you couple that with, some changes that happen real quick in behaviors or things in the workplace that we might perceive as disrespectful or non-professional, it's not personal. Um, Folks are advocating for themselves, they're prioritizing their health, they're looking at work in a different way. Maybe there's something that can be learned from that. But if we're about relationships again, right, we have to find some way to navigate that, some middle ground. Like I mentioned in the slide, I care a lot less about what you do. I care more about how you get there.
Yeah, that's actually, I was just thinking about, I think my organization is, moving in the direction of being trauma informed and, taking steps to address, we've already acknowledged last year was a crappy year. How can we avoid that again? And, what tactics can we take to reduce stress levels and, react to them if we need to? And I guess, given we're such a small organization, obviously these sort of efforts take time. We don't have an HR person that can help us deliver that. And I think staff, our support, they know that it takes time and we're all working on it together. So I'm hoping I have one here attending, but I think they know and appreciate that we're moving in the right direction together, and hopefully can appreciate the time that it also takes to implement.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Laura. I'll just kind of add in, um, like I said, nonprofits, right? Most people are wearing multiple hats, and HR tends to be one of the last things that comes up for folks. You can get fractional HR, you can outsource HR. But what I want to caution everybody with is over the years, HR has kind of become a vehicle to shoulder leadership's responsibilities, um,
Mm-hmm.
cleaning up messes, solving problems. Culture is not HR's responsibility, right? Culture is our responsibility as leaders. Training and development, new employee doesn't have skills, have them get with HR and take a training on it. But if I'm relational, no, I got to take the time and teach that. So yes, absolutely seek out, some formal HR services, but not at the expense of offloading some of your executive leadery type responsibilities.
I guess kind of building off of some of what Laura was saying with, a really small team and Laura and I work together. I guess I'm interested in what you think the response and kind of resources look like for small nonprofits that have less financial capacity or staff capacity to, make changes or provide certain wellness benefits or something like that versus larger nonprofits that do have more budget and maybe more staff that they can spread workloads between. Just kind of what does that approach? How does that differ between smaller and larger nonprofits?
Yeah, great question. Well, thanks for putting it out there. Let's start off with looking at for-profits to nonprofits, right? Across sectors, we see a lot of different things, right? For-profit organizations tend to have a lot more benefits. They tend to be bigger, and one of the drawbacks of a bigger organization is they're not as agile. What nonprofits have, particularly smaller nonprofits, is the ability to do creative things. You could create a policy today and implement it tomorrow. Whereas I've been in health systems where it would take 6 months for something like that to happen. So you have to use your agility. I think that's important. One organization I know took the time to survey employees and said what benefits would be pertinent to you. I think I mentioned the pet insurance deal. Involve them in the process. Is it incumbent on me as the leader to come up with a solution, or to facilitate the solution and include the stakeholders in the process? I'd much rather people ask me my opinion and be part of that process than not. The other thing, Will, I think we got to get creative. Leveraging boards can be huge. I think that we fail to recognize that. Once I used to have a board member come in every month and bring lunch to the leadership team, right? Like that was super cool. I achieved a lot of things by doing that. Or having the board members put care packages together for some of the staff, right? Like that's another idea. Using your nonprofit status, what organizations are you a part of? Society for Human Resource Management, like that might be a trade organization that will be worth getting connected with. Also, the Employers Council, like you can get some pretty good legal and HR services at a very reasonable price. So, Will, I hope that helps. I mean, I wish I had like a top 10 commandments, but that's the best I got right now.
Yeah, no, that definitely helps. And I think the agility piece is definitely something that is a big difference and something that smaller nonprofits can utilize and rely on.
One more response to that is, and maybe the most important, though, the mission. It's all about the mission. It's all about the organizational mission. For-profits do that really well, but their mission is to get paid. What's our mission? What's your mission? That's why people do the work. And I think it's, especially nonprofits, leaders, like we're so busy, we're so stressed out. We're not usually that good at taking the time to celebrate wins and communicate victories. I don't want to see a newsletter from any nonprofit that's not talking about how they're meeting their mission, how they're winning. When you're having your leadership meetings and your board meetings, how are you meeting your mission? Where are the successes and the things that happen in between, the beginning and the end? That makes people feel good. I feel good achieving an organizational mission that's of value versus making, the corporate company a bunch of money. You got a little bit of time. Ask another question if you want to, Laura.
I don't think I have any right now. I might in a month or two.
So let me ask the group a question. What made you decide to attend this or the one last week or both of them? What was the catalyst for that? You could type it in the chat or you can just say it out loud.
Stress. We're all
Same.
stressed. Yeah, I mean, for us, it was, our 4-person team acknowledged that every single one of us was stressed at a a certain time of the year last year. And I think we all acknowledged that we felt very much alone in that stress. We weren't necessarily I mean, we were still a team, but we weren't able to help each other. And so we decided that we needed to meet and talk about it. And now, we're moving forward and taking steps to operate as a better, more cohesive team that can support each other and, educate ourselves on, what is right for us. What are some things that we can do to either alleviate or better respond to that stress? And so, yeah, and I'm a new member of the Colorado Nonprofit Association, so taking advantage of all the different webinars that they're offering.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, go to the online resources. There's so many videos that the Colorado Nonprofit Association has that I found value in. I've shared with my clients. But yeah, thanks for putting that out there. Love to hear from some other folks in the chat or verbally. What made you decide to attend this webinar? People are probably eating their lunch. It's cool. I don't like dragging meetings on. Whenever I schedule meetings, I always try to schedule for like 50 minutes instead of an hour, right? Um, I was telling Haley before you guys got on the call, sometimes I would start my lunchtime meetings at like 12:05, so people have 5 minutes to, do whatever they needed to do. So maybe we'll do the same thing today. I don't have a problem wrapping it up early. We have about 15 minutes more scheduled. Are there any kind of final questions anyone has or comments?
Definitely looking forward to getting the slide deck. It seemed like there was a lot of good resources in there and stuff. So yeah, looking forward to that, kind of clicking through those links and stuff.
Yeah, well, you should get that in the next day or two. And my contact information's in there. Always happy to have a conversation. Thanks for reaching out. And then Haley put in the chat for anyone that didn't see it. It's called the Knowledge Center. That's where there's a whole bunch of resources, including the videos of online training. So you'll be able to find this in the Knowledge Center.
Yeah,
Anybody
so
else?
sorry, just following up on what Will said. Yeah, just in case anyone hopped in a little bit late, yeah, I'll be sending out the follow-up end of day today, early tomorrow, so it will have last Thursday's and today's slide deck. I'll hyperlink out a couple of the resources Jay provided in those PowerPoints as well. But you'll still be able to download and click into any of them, just so you can access everything. Recordings will be in there, so a lot of great resources.
Thank you. This was helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. I wish you the best on your journey, and yeah, use some of the stuff in the PowerPoint. Ask for help. Use your board.
Yeah, thank you all so much for coming. And thank you, Jay, for putting on this two-part series. I think it was a lot of great information.
Thanks for having me. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.